Everybody having a good Sabbath so far? Has it been a shalomful Shabbat? It's one of those horribly anglicized Hebrew words. All right. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome again to everybody that's a regular. Welcome to our guests, to the digital viewers. How many of those we have? So today, I'm going to continue a series that we've kind of been running these last few weeks. What we had decided to do, because we're a new fellowship, we've only been meeting in this building since beginning of April, so not even 2 full months yet. So just to recap, we're going over the foundations, right? The first week we started out, I spoke about identity, right? Excuse me. And talked about what is our identity as a believer individually, right? What does it mean to be an image bearer of God? What is your identity corporately? What does it mean to be part of Israel, right? Last week, Jeff followed up with sort of part 2 of this series is on the gospel. Right? What is the gospel? The good news. He talked about that it's more than just say this prayer and you'll get to be in heaven with Jesus. It's about the kingdom. Amen. So if you're watching, if you're listening, if you didn't hear the teaching from 2 weeks ago or Jeff from last week, you can find those online. Obviously, I won't be rehashing every single thing. For today's topic, it might almost seem like a bit of an oxymoron, right? I mean, today we're looking at Sabbath. It's kind of a given. We're already here, right? So a Sabbath right now, obviously everybody here already has an understanding and an appreciation of the Sabbath. If you didn't, you probably wouldn't be here today. But sometimes with these sorts of things, we consider them so fundamental, so basic, that we overlook some of the differences between us, some of the different ways that we've come to understand or observe things. Because they're just so simple. It's just a given. Don't go to work, keep Shabbat, rest, that sort of thing. So with today's message, I want to achieve primarily 4 things. The first one is I want to introduce the Sabbath for any guests, and so that we can get the same sort of background information, so we can all start from the same place. The second thing is to discuss a little bit of the Sabbath to Sunday transition. How did that happen? The third thing is to discuss the two aspects of Sabbath. And the last one is to offer some practical guidance and advice, or at least I hope so. So the first one is introducing the Sabbath. The best place to start is in the beginning, right? Begin with the beginning. So what is the Sabbath and why is it significant? The Sabbath is the 7th day of the week, a day that we in modern English usually call Saturday. It begins on Friday at sunset. We get this from the very beginning of Scripture in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. So the heavens and the earth were completed along with their entire array. God completed on the 7th day his work that he made, and he ceased on the 7th day from all his work that he made. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, that is, he set it apart. For on it he ceased from all his work that God created for the purpose of preparing. So in all of the creation account leading up to this, we read, and there was evening and there was morning, the 3rd day, 4th day, 5th day, and so on. So we learn this sort of pattern, evening, morning, day. Leviticus 23, 26 through 32, which speaks specifically of the Day of Atonement, which is a special Sabbath, is to be observed from evening to evening. Additionally, we find more evidence of this evening to evening pattern after the return of Israel from the exile in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah 13:19 says, "When evening, darkness began to fall on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath day. I commanded the doors to be shut. I further commanded that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath day. I appointed some of my attendants over the gates so that no burden could enter during Shabbat." The reason for shutting the gates in this passage was to prevent merchants from selling their wares on the Sabbath, but we'll come back to that. As we already read in Genesis 2, God rested on the 7th day. So that's what we are commanded to do as well. Leviticus 23:3, "Work may be done for 6 days, but the 7th day is a Shabbat of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You are to do no work. It is a Shabbat to Adonai in all your dwellings." So in short, thus far, we have Sabbath begins Friday at sunset, ends at Saturday at sunset. Sabbath is a day of rest, which we'll examine in a second. Sabbath is a holy day. It's set apart not by the will of man, but by the will of God. The last point is key. Sabbath is not just some Jewish thing that we choose to do. It is a holy appointed time of Yahweh. God created the Sabbath, and he gave it to Israel as he freed them from slavery in Egypt. Exodus 20, starting at verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to work 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Shabbat to Adonai your God. In it you shall not do any work, not you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, nor the outsider that is within your gates. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Thus Adonai blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. So this is stated in Exodus 20, right in the middle of the Decalogue, right? The 10 words, the 10 commandments. Just a little further on in Exodus 31, we see it reiterated again, and this time it includes actual punishments for breaking the Sabbath. We learn in Mark 2 that man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. God created and established the Sabbath himself. He actually kept it himself and set it as a principle and precedent for us. It was made for us. And I think that's a sign that he loves us, because everybody needs a day off, right? So the Sabbath to Sunday transition. So what happened? Why do we gather today while brothers and sisters in the normative church will gather tomorrow? Everyone from the Eastern Orthodox to the non-denominational evangelical Protestants will have their service tomorrow. In some denominations, they even still treat Sunday like a Sabbath, such as the Orthodox and some Reformed denominations. They refrain from work. They refrain from discussing work. They refrain from talking idly or talking about worldly things, sports and video games and all of that. They gather together. They engage in a day of spiritual reflection, meditation on God's goodness, singing praise. They basically treat it like it is the Sabbath. But why the different day? Well, I'll just say really quick, it's not a conspiracy. Okay, it's going to sound controversial, but sometimes we get into that. But it needs to be said, worship on Sunday did not begin because people wanted to worship some sun god. No doubt, I'm sure there were some pagan converts that were used to worshiping various gods on various days, and we know that, right? But the precedent of early believers gathering on Sunday did not start with pagans. It did not start in the 4th century with Constantine. It did not start with the Council of Laodicea 30 years after his death. We see very early on that many Christians took to gathering together on Sunday. They recognized the significance of the resurrection, which was announced on a Sunday. Now, I'm not wading into the debate over whether it was resurrected on Saturday, just before evening, or on Sunday, early before sunrise, or whatever. That's not the point here. That's a whole other thing. I'm simply saying that these early believers did believe that he was resurrected on Sunday. Whether they were right or wrong, that's where this precedent comes from. That's why they began to gather, because they recognized this was a special and significant day because of that event. The Didache, or Didache, depending on your accent, a very early book from the late 1st or early 2nd century, which is often attributed to the apostles, most likely it was their followers that wrote it, calls for gathering together on the Lord's Day, which was so called because of the resurrection. It was proclaimed his day because it was the day that he rose. Ignatius of Antioch, one of the early apostolic fathers of the 2nd century and most likely a disciple of the Apostle John, draws a distinction between the Sabbath, being the 7th day, and the Lord's Day. Justin Martyr, at the middle of the 2nd century, just shortly thereafter, argued for the significance of the 8th day, which, of course, is the day after Shabbat. Right? Now, the 8th day, obviously, there's only 7 days in a week. 8th day is the 1st day. All of this predates Constantine and the Council of Laodicea. But to be clear, none of this means that the Sabbath was changed. In fact, it was because so many early believers were still observing the Sabbath on the 7th day that the Council of Laodicea did issue canons, such as to abstain from working on Sunday and to stop Judaizing the Sabbath. That you wouldn't have to issue that edict of stop keeping the 7th day if nobody was. Sunday observance started off innocent enough. It was an honest attempt to honor his resurrection. What it became within a couple hundred years and remains even today as a substitute Sabbath, that became a problem. So there's nothing wrong with Going to church on a Sunday and worshiping. There's nothing wrong with recognizing his death and resurrection, congregating with other believers for worship, prayer, study on Sunday or any other day. But none of that changes that the seventh day is the Sabbath, the day of ceasing from work. So on the topic of work, if you're already here today, you're already a Sabbath keeper, pretty sure most everybody here is, you already know the basics. Right? God established the Sabbath day during the time of creation. It is repeatedly reiterated throughout Scripture. Over 20 times in the book of Leviticus alone, we find the repeated statement over and over again, the Sabbath is a day of rest. In it you do no work. But what if work and rest are not entirely appropriate definitions? Now, I'm getting somewhere with this. First of all, I want to say that I do think work and rest are fine ways to consider these sort of dichotomies here on Shabbat. I don't find them incorrect, but slightly insufficient. So let's take a moment to define our terms. In Genesis 2, as we read, Yahweh blessed the seventh day and he set it apart, because in it he rested from all his work. The word for rested is Shabbat. If you thought that sounds like the word Shabbat, you've got a good ear. The word doesn't mean rest in the sense we typically take it to mean, right? When we think of rest, we think of taking a nap in the hammock without having a half dozen kids barge in and yell at each other, or maybe that's just me. The point is, either way, that Shabbat does not mean to rest in the sense that we think of it. It means to cease, to stop. It's a very simple word. Whatever the thing is that's being done, stop doing that thing. That's what Shabbat means. That's what God did. At the end of creating for 6 days, at the end of creation, he stopped creating. That's actually what he did. The next point of reference is Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Again, as we already read, we're told to not do any work because Yahweh rested on the seventh day. Here, it's actually a different word. Right? We do not find the word shavat as we did in Genesis, which means to cease, to stop. We find the word vayanach, a form of nuach, which does mean rest, or to settle, or to await. Hopefully this will get clearer here in a second. The next thing we have to define is work. Right? In Exodus 20, we read that 6 days we do all of our work. But many people aren't aware that there's actually two different words here. One's a noun, one's a verb. The NASB helps highlight this. It says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Right? Labor and work. Labor here is the verb, avad, and work is the noun, malacha. These two words refer to similar, related, but different concepts. Okay? Avad, the verb, is the word for service, which is why in some translations it is translated as servile work. It is work that is performed in service of someone else. Malacha is work, but specifically creative work, because it relates to the creating work that Yahweh accomplished in those first 6 days as described in Genesis 2. So these two concepts of service and creative work are the things that are prohibited on Shabbat. And these two aspects of work are contained within two separate reasons for Shabbat itself. Now, we've already read, right, and we've already mentioned the Sabbath passages of Exodus 20, which is the Ten Commandments, and Exodus 31. But both of those state that we keep the seventh day. It is the Shabbat. Yahweh gave it to us to keep it because on the seventh day he rested. That's the reason stated in those passages. But there's actually another reason given. Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 15 says, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as Adonai your God commanded you. 6 days you are to labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Shabbat to Adonai your God. In it you are not to do any work, not you, your son, your daughter, your slave, your maid, your ox, your donkey, your livestock, or the outsider within your gates, so that your slave and your maid may rest as you do. Verse 15 of Deuteronomy 5 says, you must remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore Adonai your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Did you catch the subtle difference? Was there a mention of creation in this passage? No. Right? In Exodus, the reason given for keeping Shabbat is related to creation. God rested the seventh day, so we do the same thing. But here in Deuteronomy 5, which is also a bit of a reframing of the Ten Commandments, right? He's essentially relisting the Decalogue once again, the 10 commands, the 10 words. We have no reference to creation here. In fact, an entirely different reason is given. You must remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God has brought you out from there. Therefore, he commanded you to keep the Sabbath. Now, this is not a replacement reason. It's an additional reason. It's a renewed reason. right? It is no less true that when Moses writes Deuteronomy that God ceased working on Shabbat. That reason still stands. But after they've left Egypt in the Exodus, now there's an additional reason, and it relates to the word labor. See, as I mentioned a few moments ago, labor is the word avad, right? It means to service, to serve, but specifically to serve someone else. It's a word that is sometimes translated as referring to service to God, but in general, it's service to someone else. So here are the two aspects of work. Work, that is creative work. We abstain from doing it on the Shabbat because Yahweh ceased creating for the Shabbat. And so we are told to follow this example. We cease or stop creative work. Servile work, service, labor, that is work performed in service to others. The implication here being that it is work for your master, right? Or in today's world, your employer. And we abstain from it because God brought Israel out of the house of slavery and, by extension, as we learn in the New Testament, all of us from slavery to sin. We rest from labor performed in service of others. Now, I don't want to just give you a few interesting facts, right? My goal here ultimately is not that you go home thinking, how neat, I never realized there are actually two different reasons for keeping Sabbath, not just one. It's great that we learn more about Scripture together, but if all we're accomplishing is filling our theological informational databases, then we're missing the point. So for this final section here, I want to, hopefully, offer some practical application and guidance. I've been asked the question, seriously, over the last 10, 15 years, countless times, is such and such work? Can I do X, Y, Z on the Sabbath? Now, granted, there is some cases where the motivation is because someone has something they don't want to give up, right? We all have that. We all have something that we find difficult to not do on Shabbat. But in general, I have found the question to be sincere. People honestly want to know, if that thing is work, I want to know so that I don't do the thing. I think in our walk, especially as Sabbath keepers, like I said, we've all had this struggle. Can I cook? Can I garden? Can I go to my cousin's wedding? Can I go to the gym? Can I go out for lunch? Right, these are all examples that I've heard actual questions of before. It's not a new question. It's one of the oldest biblical questions, in fact. And while not all of these are answered, certainly in some ways, some are. Now, really quick, I'm going to quote the rabbis here to give you a picture of what Jews in the early first couple centuries did believe was work, right? And the reasons why. In the rabbinic writings, there are 39 types of work that are identified. They're called the 39 melachot. Remember, I mentioned earlier, malacha is a word for work. So 39 types of work. And if you're unaware, that this rabbinic writing comes from about the 4th, 5th, 6th century, somewhere in there. Now these 39, I'm going to go ahead and list all 39. They're sowing, plowing, reaping, gathering and binding, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, cleaning, combing, dyeing, as in not like literally death, but, making something a different color. And clarify that. Spinning, stretching thread, making loops, weaving threads, separating threads, tying a knot, untying a knot. I'm going to be really, really specific here. Sewing, tearing, trapping, slaughtering. And you would say, well, hang on, don't you have offerings offered on the Sabbaths and the high days? Skinning, tanning, smoothing, ruling lines, cutting, writing, erasing, building, breaking down, kindling a fire, extinguishing a fire, striking the final hammer blow, apparently not actually using a hammer, just the final one, just the last one, right? Seriously. Only the final blow. And lastly, carrying. According to the rabbis, these are the prohibited types of work. Now, you may have noticed a pattern in those very specific sorts of actions, but if you didn't, I'll explain. The first 11 are types of field work, right? Sowing, plowing, reaping, that sort of thing. That seems pretty intuitive, right? For a farming society, an agrarian society like ancient Israel was, most people, their job description was a farmer. So you farm every day. You reap, you sow, you plant, you harvest. Don't do that on Shabbat. That seems pretty self-explanatory. The next 13 things all relate to making cloth curtains. That sounds extremely specific, right? Shearing wool, combing, dyeing, again, colors. Making loops. The next 7 things relate to leather work, specifically for leather curtains. Trapping, skinning, tanning, slaughtering, specifically for this purpose. The next 2, writing and erasing, are a reference to making and erecting support beams. You would say that doesn't Sound like it makes a whole lot of sense. Building and breaking down are another category. And lastly, kindling or putting out a fire, carrying and striking the final blow of a hammer all relate to finishing a project. So if you didn't pick up on it, I'll go ahead and give you the answer now. These categories are all the types of work that pertain to the construction of a specific thing. Does anybody know what that was? Tabernacle, the Mishkan. All of these were the types of work involved in creating the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness. Now, in Judaism, there are some additional prohibitions on the Sabbath, but I'm not going to go into all that. We would literally be here all day. All of these types of work are creative work, right? Creative work, according to the rabbis. There are the types of work that are involved in creating the tabernacle, and this should be fascinating to most of us because the tabernacle is a parallel to God's dwelling on the earth, right? The tabernacle was God's dwelling place among men. The original intended dwelling place of God among men was supposed to be the Garden of Eden, right? That's what it was. So the types of work that were identified to refrain from, I think these are a good guideline. I think they're a good starting point. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, and I don't think most of this necessarily applies to most of us today. Most of us aren't tanners, right? We're not taking a day off to stop tanning leather. And I'm also not here to tell you what you're allowed to do on Shabbat or not. But I do want to remind everyone of what Scripture says, and sometimes I need that reminder as well. Hopefully nobody's feeling judged. I'll accept a little spirit-filled conviction. I don't want judgment. I'll talk to myself here too. So, should you plant your garden on Shabbat? After all, you find it restful, it's relaxing. But is it work? That's really ultimately the question. If you're not ceasing from that work, you're probably not observing Shabbat. There are 6 other days for that. God spent 6 days planting a garden too, right? But he rested from it. What about going to a restaurant? After all, I'm not working, I'm just eating. The church that I grew up in, we kept the Sabbath, we kept the feast, we kept the food laws. I was raised this way. My mom was raised this way. You know, my grandparents started doing this stuff. But after service, every Sabbath, we'd go out to eat. Sundown or not, we'd go out to eat. If we didn't have something for lunch, we'd run across the street to the store, grab lunch, heat it up, and hunky-dory. I never even thought about it till I was a teenager. Never even considered it until I was a teenager. And someone else actually pointed out, hey, why are you doing that on Shabbat? I was like, why not? Right? That sort of mentality of, well, I'm not working, I'm just eating, right? It sort of misses the point. As we read in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, the Sabbath is a commandment not just for us, but also for our households. No work for us, no work for our children, no work for our servants, or even our beasts of burden. If I go to a restaurant, I have a waiter whose job is to serve me, or the cashier at the store. Further, we have the issue of exchange of commerce, which, as we saw earlier in Nehemiah, was exactly what he was prohibiting. He was stopping them from coming in and buying and selling their wares on Shabbat. Now, I know we live in a fallen world. There's always things that will be beyond our control. There's an employee at the power plant right now to keep the lights on, and that's obviously a thing we're utilizing, right? And yes, he would be there even if we all turned our lights out. But there's only so much that we have direct control over, in particular, those with whom we have direct interaction. I can only control what is in my power to control. That includes going to Walmart, like I said, as I did even up into my teen years, or to the restaurant, etc. I can buy what I need on Friday. I know somebody inevitably is thinking, well, you're being too harsh. What about when your ox is in the ditch, right? So let's look at that. I don't have a problem with that statement. It's a completely biblical statement. This story, the ox in the ditch, as we say, comes from Luke 14, starting at verse 1. Now, when Yeshua went into the home of one of the leaders of the Pharisees to eat a meal on Shabbat, they were watching him closely. And there before him, was a man swollen with fluid. Verse 3, so Yeshua said to the scribes and the Pharisees, is it permitted to heal on Shabbat or not? They kept silent. So Yeshua took hold of him and healed him, and he sent him away. And he said to them, which of you, when a son or an ox falling into a well on the Shabbat, will not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things. They sought to trap him, and he trapped them, usually answering a question with a question, which is a very rabbinic thing to do. In another related scenario from John 7, Yeshua says that they all agree about circumcising on Shabbat. right? He says, will you not circumcise a man on Shabbat in order to keep with the Torah? So again, in that passage as well, the context here is about healing. The context there is about fulfilling a commandment on Shabbat that, well, if this type of, circumcising, if that's work, what about when it falls on the Sabbath? Well, there's a precedent here, right? And it relates to another principle that the Jews will say is pikuach nefesh, the watching over of a soul. Some will call it the saving of a life, right? In Leviticus 18:5, Yahweh says, you shall keep my statutes and my laws, which a person shall do and live by them. So one of the rabbis interprets this to mean that we are to live by them, meaning not allow one of them to cause our death. That's pretty valid. So for example, if it's the Sabbath and you're a surgeon and you're not supposed to be working, but someone's dying from a wound that needs to be sewn up, well, it's acceptable to suspend the Sabbath law in order to prevent the loss of life. In fact, another story from the sages relates that even if it's Yom Kippur and this man's supposed to be fasting, if he's actually about to die, let him break his fast and eat. They would say even let him eat something unclean if that's what it takes to keep him from dying, because he can't continue to keep the commandments if he's dead. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best interpretation, but it should be something to think about. So some more real-world examples. Like I said, if it's Yom Kippur and you're fasting, but you're diabetic, have something on hand to balance out your blood sugar if you need to. If you're driving down the interstate on Shabbat and your car breaks down, call for help. Call for a tow truck, an Uber, whatever you need to get back safely. If your child spikes a high fever in the middle of Friday night, go to Walgreens. Most of them are 24 hours, buy some Tylenol. Right? These are all safety and health concerns. But remember, as Ben Franklin said, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If your car is prone to always breaking down, don't drive it on Shabbat. If you have kids, keep some Tylenol on hand so you don't need to go to the store. When your ox falls into the ditch, it's something that needs to be remedied. It needs to be addressed. Don't let harm come to it because you're afraid of breaking the Sabbath. But if your ox is falling into the ditch every single week, you probably shouldn't be keeping him pinned up near the ditch. Move him to a different pasture. So to wrap all of this up, we know that the Sabbath was made for us. Right? Yeshua says so in Mark 2. It was made for us. It was a gift for us. It is a sign between us and our Creator. It is important because even though it was made for us, it still belongs to Him. And that's the fact that we sometimes miss. Leviticus 23 doesn't start off with, here's the days that you observe. He says, these are my feasts. And it starts with Shabbat. We should take it seriously and realistically. It's a day of ceasing from work. It's a day of gathering together with other believers in community, to be encouraged, to hear the word, to fellowship together in the presence of the Almighty. Amen? Do we have any questions? Anybody want to throw stones? Let me get a running start. Now, asking for questions doesn't mean I also have the answers. I'm just asking for questions. Nope.
Hello. There we go. Okay. Cool. You might want to turn me down a little bit. Can you turn me down a little bit? You can't turn me down a little bit? Okay, there we go. That's better. There you go. That's good. Okay, cool. All right, does anybody have any questions, comments? Brian Newman? All right. You don't have to stand up. Or you can stand up if you want. I don't care. Here.
Have a seat. Oh, we're standing.
So I have a question about traveling.
Okay.
When people are traveling Shabbat, like if you're going to Tabernacles and you're on the road or whatnot, was there any kind of Jewish rabbinic thought on that? I know they didn't travel much on Sabbath day journey, or just in general. Like my adopted dad is a truck driver, for example. Was there any kind of commentary they had on those kind of situations, like getting food and whatnot?
Well, again,
I mean, general thoughts, I guess, too.
Well, again, the biggest thing is, especially for someone that's your lifestyle, right? Like you're a truck driver. When I was finishing my associate's degree, I worked part-time for McKee, factory down here that makes Little Debbie's. And McKee is owned by an Adventist family. Like the whole company keeps the Sabbath. You may not all be Sabbath keepers, but the entire company, an hour before sundown on Friday, they shut the plants down and force you out of the building. And they don't start until third shift Saturday night because they take it that seriously. McKee has their own transportation division, right? Their own trucks. They plan routes to make sure that you will always be home at the latest Friday morning, and you will never go out before Saturday night. Now, they've had instances where trucks broken down, somebody's been stuck on the road or whatever. But again, that's not the norm. So for something like that, you could say, well, but that's not the case everywhere, right? Most companies aren't honoring the Sabbath like that. Some people's job do take them away for the entire weekend. My advice in that regard, first of all, is if this is your lifestyle, if this is how you live, you know ahead of time, hey, I'm going to be gone. I'm going to be gone from, for 2 weekends, 3 weekends, whatever, right? So do everything that you can, right? We can only do as much as we can do. But what you can do is you can buy your food ahead of time, right? You can fuel up before sundown Friday. You can do whatever is in your power to do. If you are in a situation where you're actually still yourself working on Shabbat, you're still driving that truck on Shabbat, right, for your employer, the best thing I can say is try hard to move. Now, again, I know that's not realistic. I wouldn't tell somebody to quit the job and become homeless and whatever. I would say exercise faith and believe that God will take care of you, and he will be faithful when you are faithful. Beyond that, like I said, you do as much as you possibly can.
Anybody else? I had a...
I knew you were going to say that.
Oh, gosh. Don't act like you know me.
Just couldn't let it go.
I had a thought. I was thinking about this a while back because I've had several conversations. Yeah, obviously, when you have, for those of us that were not raised this way, you have a lot of family that has questions and makes accusations. There's misunderstandings about like the idea around keeping the Sabbath and what you can and cannot do when you're keeping the Sabbath. And I think that one of the things that I've noticed, and Yeshua said, because somebody's brought this particular passage up as an argument against Sabbath keeping. I'll read it just like real quick because it's just a couple verses. And he says, they were for this reason the Jews were persecuting Yeshua because he was doing these things on a Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." All right, he's saying this on a Sabbath day. And they kind of made this argument for this. Well, he said he's working right here. Boom, there it is. It's locked in. It's done. And but do you guys know what he was doing these things on a Sabbath was? In this particular context, it was he had healed a man who couldn't walk, right? And then he picked his pallet up and left. And the point is that like all work is not forbidden on Shabbat, right? The work of ministry, of like ministering to other people, it's work getting set up in the building. It's work. Matt gets here early. He sets the camera. He gets the audio system set up, ready to roll. And that takes work. I mean, anybody that's got a bunch of kids, it's work getting your kids ready to go to Shabbat to have service. It's a lot more work than it would be staying home, that's for sure. But nonetheless, I mean, there are certain aspects but I want my kids to be part of a community. I want them to be involved in worship. I want them to be discipled and to be part of a community where they're going to hear the word and where they're going to worship the Lord. And so, when people use that particular passage, you say, oh, well, guess you're just going to leave your ox in a ditch. It's right. It's like those kinds of remarks. I mean, the reality is that there are some works that are allowed during Shabbat, and it's obviously the work when the I think about like the Passover, for instance, when they were making sacrifice in the Tabernacle or in the temple. That was a lot of work. I don't know if anybody has ever slaughtered an animal, but it is neither a clean affair nor is it an easy one, right? Like there's a lot of work that takes place in doing this action. But obviously there are certain actions within the commandment that God has given that are permissible on the Sabbath day. And so
there's an example of the priests, right? Because it is a lot of work.
Yeah.
Like you just said, I mean, there's a lot of things involved that the priests did at the temple. There's a lot of things that were involved between the priests and the judges, what eventually would become the rabbis in the synagogues, those sorts of things, after the synagogue system was set up. There's a lot of quote-unquote work. There's a lot of effort, I guess is what it is. And so really the key takeaway, I think, is understanding, like I said, you have kind of two different aspects. You have creative work, right? You stop doing some of that. You have servile work. You have, work that is service to your employer, to your master, to, whatever. We would say pharaoh these days if you work for a corporation. But it's that sort of work. So you cease from that. And it's everything that is within your control, right? I mean, as far as it comes to serving someone, I can not serve my employer on Shabbat, right? I don't go to work on Sabbath. I don't open up my laptop and go answer emails and go write code on Shabbat. But I still have to serve my kids. I still feed them breakfast, right? I still get them dressed. Yeah, it's still serving. So like you mentioned, there's effort that goes into it. There is work that goes into it. But there is a differentiation here. Yeah. And it was the same thing with harvesting. Harvesting is forbidden, right? Yet the disciples went through the grain fields. That was another encounter he had over the Sabbath. And I would usually say in response, if he actually broke the Sabbath, they had an actual excuse to kill him, right? You don't need false witnesses like they needed at his trial. They had to give false witnesses to come up and accuse him of blasphemy. Well, if he actually broke the Sabbath, they would just say, see, he's a Sabbath breaker. They could prove it, but he didn't. So,
good point. Did you see that interaction this morning by chance? There was a discussion. It was funny that you brought some of the points you made up were actually, I was in a discussion with some people this morning in that little group that Josh had started. And actually, some of the points you brought up in your sermon were literally brought up in this discussion. It was actually, I thought it was amazing. It was like, I was actually thinking, like, did he actually see that? And then it just went ahead and transplanted it into his sermon today. But yeah, some of the questions that you asked, that people asked, were asked this morning. One person asked, and I think this is a good one, is it wrong to go to the gym on a Sabbath day?
well, I mean, you call it working out, right?
Right, right. Right.
You know,
picked up that he healed, and he told him, pick up your mat and walk.
Yeah.
Is that something he did every day? No.
Right.
Never done it.
Yep.
yeah, and normally the thing is, for most things, if it's something that can be done all during the week, you're probably better leaving it for the week. And if it's something that you have to ask, hey, can I do this thing? Examine yourself first, because I've done that many times. With saying, well, can I do this thing? Can I do that thing? You kind of bicker over it, and you kind of struggle with it. And well, what about a vending machine? Right? Nobody's receiving money. What about a car wash? There's no person involved, right? And we begin to ask these sorts of questions and really look for loopholes. That's really what it is. And that's an ancient thing, too. I mean, there were loopholes all across the observance of the Torah among the Pharisees. If you've not read the Talmud, there's a lot of loopholes in there.
Yeah, and there's the inverse of that, right? It's like not even using it's going too far, right? You could not even using an elevator on the Sabbath day. Yeah, not even flipping on a light switch. So it is, I think that's where I appreciate what you said. I'm not going to sit here and give you a list of things you can and can't do. Like, there is an amount of conviction that involved in every individual believer's life where they have to make that determination for themselves. Like, have I crossed the line here and from resting into something that's work, Yeah.
Like I said, I mean, it's important enough for our Creator that He did it during the week of making all things. So Sabbath is one of the original parts of creation, right? It's kind of the culmination of creation. It's a commandment that He observed Himself to set a principle and a precedent for us to do it, right? He rested as an example so that we would rest. It's important enough to Him. It should be important enough to us. Again, I'm not so dogmatic about everything to give you a list of, well, here's the 39 things you can't do. Here's the 116 things you can't do, right? But if He takes it seriously, then we should.
Anybody else have any thoughts? Questions, comments they want to share? Matt, you want to say anything?
Matt, say I'm a heretic?
Yeah, Matt said you're a heretic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been called worse.
Okay.
Everybody good? All right. So we're going to have a closing song, and then we'll be wrapped up. What? We don't have a closing song? Ooh, an online question.
Oh, it was Taryn Adams. What? Yeah, okay. Is there somebody else in here named Taryn Adams? She had a question. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Don't answer Farrah's question. I'm just kidding. Yeah, so Taryn, well, I've got someone named Taryn on here. She asked, doesn't the Hebrew word for work mean to create, tying into resting from creation?
Well, I mean, there's separate words for it, but like I said, the definition. Do what? He did. Yep. As I mentioned a little bit ago, the word for work, malacha, right, or melacha, again, depending on how you stress it, depending on your accent, it refers to creative work, right? So it's the sort of work that God in creating did. And God didn't do every conceivable possible sort of work, right? I mean, God wasn't a truck driver, right, in the 6 days of creation. So obviously he didn't need to cease from that. But there is this sort of understanding, this principle of creative work is the thing that he ceased from. And so like I said, the rabbis started with classifying the 39 types of creative work. They took the principles from the building of the tabernacle, because as the dwelling of God, they said that paralleled the building of the earth, the creation of earth and the placing of the garden and everything that he put in it. So the parallels there of creative work, but it is the word for work is the word for creative work. But there is technically a separate word that's used elsewhere for create. So we read, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? That would be bara, to create, to build, that sort of thing.
We had one more question here. Farrah asks,
Who?
Yeah, I don't know, this lady. For those of you that are watching, because there are actually several people watching now, Farrah is my wife. So we're not just disparaging some random person on the feed here.
Yeah, he's only disparaging his wife.
Yes, correct. Just only my wife here. What she had asked specifically is, I've been off and on. So, she says, I've been off and on. May have said this already, but I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the verse? She's referring to the verse in Isaiah, I believe it's Isaiah 56, where it says, abstaining from your own pleasure on the Shabbat. Where I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I have a controversial opinion about that, which is kind of my answer for 80% of everything I get asked these days. I don't think that's actually about the Sabbath proper. I don't think those passages refer to just the seventh day. If you read the whole section, he talks about the fast, right? We don't fast on Shabbat, right? Shabbat's not a fasting day. In fact, there's a whole theology of fasting in Judaism that prevented them, in many cases, from fasting on certain days. They fasted on other days, but not on Shabbat. So if it's about just Shabbat proper, the seventh day, then we have issues because he talks about the fasting. Is this the fast that I have chosen? No, but this is the fast that I have chosen, right? I think what he's talking about is Yom Kippur. Because he's talking about the way that people are being treated. He's saying, just like everything else, and Isaiah mentions this multiple times, right? Well, you kept the sacrifices, you kept the festivals, you observed these things, you observed the new moons, you observed these things, but you did it in mechanical religion, right? That's why in Isaiah he says, I detest your feasts. Well, wait a minute, they're his feasts. He doesn't hate his own feasts, right? But that's not the point. What he was saying that he detested was what they had done with it. So same thing in Isaiah 56. You're so concerned with fasting, but you're mistreating people still. So I think the idea that's being expressed in that passage about not doing your own pleasure is specifically on Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is a special sort of Sabbath where you afflict yourself. Right? You don't do that which you want. You don't have, 2 servings of dessert, right? Oh, it's Shabbat. It's my cheat day. right? If you're on a diet. Never done that before. You don't do those things on Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is the day that you afflict your soul, right? You humble yourself. So again, between the context of the passage as a whole and the mention of fasting, I don't think that's just about any old Sabbath. I don't think the prohibition is on doing your own pleasure on Shabbat. For example, coming here is pleasurable on Shabbat. Coming here and worshiping together with this body of believers. That is what I desire to do. So if I'm not supposed to, well, I got to stay home by myself, lock myself in a closet or something, right?
Cool. Yep, that was it. Your talit's falling down, by the way.
Oh, I want to show my shoulder.
All right.
Here. All right, so we'll set up with a closing song here in a second. And then we will have the benediction and break for oneg, which I apologize to people watching online. I don't have oneg to provide you with today. Sorry. Not physically, anyway. Spiritual food, we can do that.